On which note, my next
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
Is a leader who develops people around them, is that the real sweet spot that you're looking for? Someone is that what you should be as cognizant of as a leader as anything else? As much as results, as much as outputs, is it how are the people around me developing? And how do we qualify that?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because I think the instinct is to say those types of things are in some way exclusive to each other. Well, I need to focus on delivering the results, so I don't have time to develop people. But actually, I think the key is about making the connection to say the key to delivering results is to develop a team that is capable of using its full intellectual capacity to the maximum potential. So again, it comes back to this idea of what's my identity as a leader. Now, in the original, where our origin comes from in terms of the intent-based approach, what David Marquet, who's the captain of the submarine, recognized subsequently was that the number of officers that left that submarine, having worked in that intent-based environment, who then went on to command their own submarines or to become admirals in the US Navy, was something like 10 times the average for a submarine. So one of the questions for us as leaders is, what's our legacy? Is our legacy to be that when we leave, we're going to be tremendously missed for all of the amazing skills and knowledge that we had? Or is the legacy that when we leave a really, really strong team in place? It goes back to the ego, doesn't it? Because, our ego plays in the sense of, well, if I leave, secretly, I want to feel that I'm going to be really missed. But actually, I think as leaders, if I leave and leave a really strong position, strong group, strong team in place, that's the most powerful representation for me of a leadership quality.
Would you say then that, and of course we do all like to think we're indispensable at work, and then we're off work for a period of time, whatever it might be, and we soon discover that we're not.
Yeah.
Which is a healthy thing. Ideally, though, is what you're saying, that I'm not saying that the leader should put themselves, the aim of a leadership role should almost be to make your role obsolete. That's not quite what you're saying.
I think that you could kind of work to that as an ideal, but in reality, we still want to have a role, but that role and the success comes through the development of a team. And if we're successful, our success might be not to be our roles to become redundant, but somebody to step up into our role and for us to go off and to lead another team. So I don't think it's about making ourselves not needed, because actually if we do it really well, given the state of play, we're probably going to be attractive to another organization or another team.
So in that vein, Peter, I read that you'd said that you've not yet met the perfect leader. And I don't know if you have in the time that you gave that interview and now, or if you've still not met the perfect leader.
No, I think it's a kind of oxymoron.
You're right, yeah.
I've met a few who think they are.
Yeah. What are the attributes that you see then that define the best leaders in your experience?
I spent a bit of time with a leadership team yesterday, and it's fresh in my mind. I think my starting point would be curiosity, which is both an interest in others, but critically an interest in other people's perspectives. What is it that you can see that I can't see? What's the potential that we have here that you can see that I might not be able to see? So I think curiosity is a starting point. I think the idea of humility is the principle of humility we talk about quite a lot. And I think what I mean by that is the ability to be able to recognize the impact that you have on other people. So as leaders, again, what we want to do is to be able to build strong teams, strong and confident teams. But one of the things that we need to be careful about is, does the very role of us being the senior leader create a what we would describe as a power gradient? Now, let's take it out of a legal context, but put it into, let's say, a medical context, and imagine the operating theatre, where you have a surgeon leading a team. And what you really want is, if you're the patient, you might think, well, I really want a strong leader to be in this position. I want them to be a very confident person, giving all of the directions and be absolutely certain about what they're doing. And that makes sense. But what you also want is a nurse who's going to speak up, who can say, "Doctor, I've just spotted something which we might need to be aware of, or I've just spotted that you might have just left a piece of equipment in the wrong place." The risk is that when we operate in hierarchies, our positions reinforce this sense of the power gradient, and people don't have the confidence to speak up, either because there's a kind of fear of, well, what if I challenge them and what are they going to say? But probably more in more reality, an assumption of, well, they're the leader, they must be right. They must be right. So let's put that into the context of a legal situation, and the partner is expressing an opinion and a perspective. The risk is then, for other people in the room, they might think, well, he or she's the partner, they must be right. And so the idea here, I think, from a humility perspective, is being able to recognize the impact that I might have on other people in the room, and making it as easy as possible for people to be able to speak up and to contribute.
So emotional intelligence then, and keeping some room for doubt.
Well, so it's a really interesting question around emotional intelligence. Hard to disagree, of course, but then can you train yourself to become emotionally intelligent? So this is where it goes back to, can you learn to be a leader? So what we would say is, you can learn to use the practices, right? And the practices then help you to develop that intelligence, which might not necessarily become naturally. So if I practice asking open questions rather than asking closed questions, it might not come naturally to me from an emotional intelligence perspective, but I'll achieve the same output. So it's a really interesting question around, can you learn to be emotionally intelligent? I don't know the answer to that, but I know that you can practice, you can use practices which allow you to develop that intelligence.
Do you think people, particularly obviously those people in leadership roles, whether in the legal industry or other industries, are more open to these ideas and those types of conversations than they were before the pandemic?
I think, Jim, to be honest, I'm not sure that the pandemic has necessarily made a difference there. I think it's impacted in terms of the quality of those discussions. It might have made it harder. Certainly during the kind of most intense periods, I guess everybody was kind of knuckling down and saying, we've just got to get things done. My instinct is that it probably hasn't had a profound impact in terms of leaders now saying, oh, I need to do something differently. I think we're so deeply, the industrial model of leadership is so deeply ingrained in terms of the way in which we work. It's really hard to break out of.
Peter, thank you. And I'll maybe just ask a supplementary question there about change, actually, because as you say, it's hard to break out of those ways of thinking, those ways of working. Change is one of those words that people use an awful lot. That's a lot easier to say than do.
Yeah.
And what words of advice would you offer to those people who are going through some changes? So many businesses have been over the last 2 or 3 years. That change is still evolving all the time. What words of advice would you offer to people around change? For example, being the agent of change is a lot more fun than having change imposed on you. So would you just say a word about change and because it's so prevalent?
Yeah, I guess what you need as an agent of change probably then also tells us about what do we do if we're a recipient or on the end of change. So first thing is that we know that absolutely essential is understanding why is this happening, and creating ownership. And what we see is that the change is often imposed on an organization or as a team. So I think it's reasonable for us to push back and say, okay, so we need real clarity in terms of what's the proposition behind this. I'd also say there's an element in terms of, if we're on the, as recipients of change, it's reasonable that we can expect clarity, but also reasonable that we can bring our own expertise and experience into a situation. Now, it's difficult. I'm not saying this is the panacea, because sometimes organizations do change really, really badly. Say sometimes, quite often. So this isn't a guarantee of, well, do this, everything's going to be fine. I think, however, if we're on the end of change, it's reasonable to keep asking the questions. Be clear about the purpose. What's the end goal that we're working to? And how do I best contribute towards this? What's the information and perspective that I've got that might help make better decisions? So if I think about what the core of intent-based leadership is about, it's fundamentally about getting organizations, leaders, and teams to make better decisions, because you use the insight from the people who are closest to the work. And when we think about change, what often happens is that change is made in a completely separate part of the organization, impacts on people who are actually doing the work, and then people wonder why haven't we been successful in this change, and B, people seem to be really disengaged. So there's not a magic tool. I think the key thing then, in terms of what we should focus on, if you're responsible for change, then creating that why, creating ownership, not just telling people we've got to change, working on a real practical basis in terms of moving. Don't focus on the theory of why we've got to change, is what difference are we expecting to see. But I think the final piece is asking people to engage with it in terms of, let's experiment and see what happens. So let's boil it down to thinking about change on the theme that we've been talking about in terms of post-pandemic working arrangements. I suspect now this is probably causing as much tension and office and politics in organizations than anything else, because people have now got their preference. This is what, by the way, this is what it sounds like. I heard it early on this week. It's been decided that Wednesday's the day in which everybody's going to be in the office. Wednesday, but that's the day now I do this. I mean, that really doesn't work for me, right? So this is a classic situation. In that scenario, I think we have to go back to saying, look, we want to experiment. We've got to make change. These are the reasons that we're doing it. We're asking for your commitment to participate, and we're going to treat it as an experiment, and we're going to review it in 3 months' time, 6 months' time, 9 months' time, and so forth. So you, again, from a decision-making perspective, if you try and wait until everybody's on board, you'll never make the decision. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge people have got different perspectives. And by saying we're asking for a commitment to action rather than changing your belief, it makes it slightly easier for people to engage with.
Thanks, Peter. And just lastly, my question would be, obviously you've worked in this industry for some time now, and you will have seen the ideas evolve and change. And I would ask you then, in future, I know you've spoken about, rather than having a chief operating officer, you might want to have a chief enabling officer, and observed coaching being a thing that would be a really useful tool. What will the best businesses do in future, do you think, in this field?
Well, I suppose it's a natural extension of the idea that we're now working, we have been for a while, predominantly in this knowledge economy, right? And in a knowledge economy, the language and approach that we take to leading people has to be different to the approach that we took 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Now, every workplace now looks fundamentally different, I would suggest. Maybe there's 1 or 2 law firms that still look the same as they did 50 years ago. But most work environments have fundamentally changed. The question is, has the language changed? So here's a simple example. We want to hire somebody with a can-do attitude. Okay. What about the ability to think? So what is it about our language that has kind of still remains in that industrial language of 50, 100 years ago, where we still talk about, we have a brainstorm, which is the idea, you know, at some point, everybody's going to come in a room and use their brains. Well, we want people to be able to use their brains and to be thinking all the time. You know, the worst example that you might hear is, well, you know, you're not paid to do the thinking here, you're paid to do the doing, just get on with it, right? So for me, the future, and when we think about the future of organizations and the future of leadership, it's about the adjustment of language to recognize that our principal role as leaders is to maximize the intellectual capability of the teams that we work with. Very few organizations now rely on people using their hands, but how many organizations we still observe saying, we're going to have an all hands meeting? Really? So when we hear we're going to have an all heads meeting, then we might have crossed that Rubicon in terms of understanding our role as leaders now is not to direct people to complete a physical task, but to think about how we use their knowledge and skills to best effect.
Thank you for taking the time to do that. There's some absolute gems in there.
Thanks very much, Jim. Really enjoyed it.